Okay, so in this part I want to touch upon Ritz's idea of what the four components of McDonaldization lead to, which is what he calls the irrationality of rationality. Now, to broaden this out a little bit, I think this becomes quite useful for a critique of neoliberalism in general, the way that kind of our dominant forms of economics at the moment compels us to think of each other as that notion of homo economicus that I touched upon in a previous lecture, where we're this kind of, seen in these systems as of kind of, rational robotic decision-making machines where we don't really kind of have emotions and we're always trying to, make decisions for instant gratification and success and competition, where it's argued that that is not a really accurate description of how humans work. What the idea of irrationality of rationality shows is that these rational systems, the idea that we kind of relate to each other through these dehumanized relationships, doesn't really lead to many of the promises of that form of economic philosophy. In fact, it leads to all kinds of irrationalities that actually are to the detriment of human life. So Ritzer acknowledges that there's lots of benefits for these systems, that they do in some ways make things more efficient, in inverted commas there. But what he says is that the systems kind of end up turning on themselves and creating irrationalities where there should be rationalities, creating inefficiencies where there should be efficiencies. And particularly these things contribute to an increasing kind of dehumanizing relationship between people. And Ritzer argues that within these systems, life becomes disenchanted. There's less spontaneity, less creativity, less kind of, human relations going on. So the examples of this, in terms of the McDonald's examples, is there's often really long lines at the drive-through. The food itself is much less nourishing than kind of organically produced vegetables and things like that. There's rationality in terms of the ways that the import-export system sees this kind of food move around the world that's really wasteful and increases the kind of global ecological footprint that makes it unsustainable. The notion that in terms of the way that McDonald's and these kind of fast food restaurants promote a form of false friendliness that kind of sets up this situation where that the person talking to you and serving you is reading from a script, so you therefore kind of behave almost as if you're talking to a robot and there's no real kind of human connection going on. So what he also does then is kind of move beyond the McDonald's system and show how these kind of irrationalities come to dominate other forms of life. Particularly here, and we'll talk about this in future weeks, is that the notion of simulation becomes to dominate many of these exchanges where there's a kind of illusion of reality going on. And you can point to things like in pop culture where there was, bands, weren't really singing their own songs, Milli Vanilli being a great example for that. Lemon detergent doesn't actually have any lemons in it. So there's more a kind of simulation, and this is a kind of irrationality that removes real human experiences and real human connections and organic and creative experiences as well. Particularly here in terms of moving outside of consumption itself and thinking of wider world, Ritzer makes some really interesting points about how the employment system of McDonald's has become the norm across many sectors of society. The rise of precarity, the rise of short-term contracts, the use of minimum wages, the use of disciplinary measures within the workplace and forms of surveillance as a way of disciplining people as well. The rise of the kind of youth wage, which is seen as a completely normal thing these days, where for some reason young people need to accept less money than older people, and we don't even really critically engage with this anymore, and even though they can be doing exactly the same work. So here there's the idea of the rise of McJob, the way that McDonald's employs people. It's become a kind of way that people have been employed across not just the service sectors, but even in things like universities and professional realms now. That notion of precarity becomes to dominate the labour market. We also know that this kind of stuff, this logic has come to dominate, other important spheres of society. So certainly the kind of notions of efficiency of consumer culture have come to produce much more waste, which we'll look at in kind of detail later on in the course. As health systems become increasingly rationalised, as they're funded less and less, there's less people working there, with more precarious labour and all that kind of stuff. It sees things like waiting lists extend, and people then die on waiting lists, which is probably the ultimate example of the irrationality of rationality. If you want to turn your attention here to university systems, there's a strong argument to be made that maybe university systems themselves are being McDonaldized. Maybe the very fact that you're consuming this course in 4 weeks online and not integrating with other people really at all may be a really good example of that. That here universities may be framed as kind of an assembly line to produce competent and disciplined workers. Where the experience of learning itself, where learning is meant to be the idea that you engage with things from the wider world that aren't necessarily about you, and you embrace them and make yourself a more better moral or ethical person by relating to others and to knowledge through that education, becomes jettisoned out of the university system, and it's all just about creating a good worker. And from the individual perspective, in terms of the illusio, if we think back to Bourdieu, university becomes nothing but for getting a job. So again, these are examples of that McDonaldization process that moves it out of the restaurant, out of consumer culture, and maybe comes to dominate other parts of society. So importantly here, you would think, a real indication of this is that now within education and within health systems, people are thought of as consumers, not necessarily as patients or students. They're consumers, and they're treated as such by those institutions. So, in terms of what Ritzer has to say about this, not a lot of good stuff, right? He sees this as being kind of a real detriment to the way that humans are going to relate to each other. You can hear echoes here of Weber's iron cage, that will be trapped in these systems, efficient systems that produce irrationalities, that mean that they may even move beyond our control. And you have the likes of Elon Musk kind of at the moment, publicly talking about how artificial intelligence needs to be fundamentally reined in. So this kind of stuff Ritzer was predicting a long time ago, and that he doesn't hold a lot of really kind of positive things for the future, like Weber. He sees that as these systems have globally expanded, they've become dominant, they've become normalized, and there's probably little hope of a reversal of these processes. But in terms of the politics, he sees struggling against this as being worthwhile and maybe ennobling in and of itself, that we can express human reason by fighting against these systems. Now, I would say that in terms of McDonald's and McDonaldization, really you may be able to successfully argue now that the McDonald's model has somewhat started to fail, if not recede. For the first time, I think in recent years, McDonald's franchises have been closing all around the world, and I think there's less of them now than there was 5 or 10 years ago. But if we move beyond the idea of just McDonald's here and talk about the processes that Ritz is talking about, I think it's difficult in many respects not to argue that he's got a lot of interesting and vital things to say about how consumer culture has been integrated into other important parts of the world, important parts of our day-to-day life. And this has real kind of problems in terms of human happiness and creativity. I think Ritz is really interesting in terms of this stuff. What I'm going to look at in the third part of the lecture is some kind of not just critical analysis of McDonaldization, but other ways of thinking that kind of can be brought into this model to think about some of the complexities that are going on here as well. Now, finally, for this section, I just want to quickly touch upon Breiman here, because the reading talks about that. I'm not going to go into any detail, but Breiman constructs a kind of similar model about how society is evolving to Ritz's McDonaldization, and he talks about the Disneyization. And this is, I think, again, particularly interesting for thinking about consumer culture and the ways that the notion of the fun park have become have come to dominate much of the way consumer culture is done. And it's not just things here like Disney. You can see here that even things like shopping malls now take on much of the stuff that Breiman talks about here. So the notion of theming is really important in his model, to create a world of your own. So you can go to a shopping mall now and not just buy stuff, you can go to the movies and, get your hair done and do all this stuff that's kind of maybe central to your lifestyle. You don't have to go to anywhere else. And that's a kind of form of social gravity there to bring people in so they can one-stop shop kind of thing. There's de-differentiation, again, bringing separate fields of consumption together, as I was just talking about there, where you can watch movies and maybe ride roller coasters and shop all in the same place. So many of those huge malls in America have roller coasters and things like that within them, and rides and all that kind of stuff, to try and have all the entertainment possible that you would want to do on a weekend just in this one spot. There's merchandising, and particularly the idea of synergy and movie tie-ins become to dominate consumer culture, where movies seem to be as much now as kind of creating an opportunity to sell toys as it is to for making money through people going to see the movie themselves. And again, the creation of those consumer products, usually made in sweatshops, usually made with chemicals, usually very environmentally unfriendly. We'll look at that later on in the course. Now, interestingly here, Bryman also wants to talk about that notion of false friendliness, where there's people in these systems forced to play a particular role, forced to play and perform a scripted service, and this has fundamental implications for the way that humans start to relate each other as these kind of scripted situations become to dominate more and more of the ways that we interact. So yeah, certainly have a look at the reading on that. It goes into a bit more detail, and if you're interested in the Disneyization, there's both journal articles and a book by Bryman that unpacks that information a lot more.